Hey, it's Dan, and in this video we're going to flush the brake fluid on this BMW S1000RR. This job's about a 2 out of 5 for difficulty, should take you less than an hour to finish. It's great news because it's really something that you should do on your bike and also on your cars every couple of years. What you're going to need is a couple of box wrenches, so an 8mm for the front and 11mm for the back. This is to open up the bleeder valve on the calipers. It's usually best to use one of the ones that are closed like this, because then you can move back and forth as you open and close the valve. You also need a tube that attaches onto the bleeder valve. So I'm using a catch bottle like this with a clear hose. It's important that the hose is actually clear so that you could see the fluid coming out of there. That's how you tell when the old fluid is completely out of the system. When it gets lighter, you can tell that it's fresh. And also that's how you watch out for any air bubbles. So clear tube and a couple of box wrenches. Now, what makes this job unique for this motorcycle is that it's a BMW with an ABS system. That means that to do the job properly, what you need to do is use a tool like the GS911 to activate the ABS module and get the old fluid out of the module and then bleed the system one more time. We'll use the standard bleeding method, meaning that we'll apply the brakes, we'll open the bleed valve, that's going to push the old fluid out through the bleed valve into the catch can. We'll then close the bleed valve and release the brake. We'll do this over and over again. As you're doing this, you want to keep a close eye on the reservoir and make sure that the brake fluid doesn't go below the lowest level. So you want to keep an eye on it and then top it off periodically. Now we'll start with the front brakes. We're going to get the master cylinder done first, then the right caliper, then the left caliper. Once the front system is flushed out, we're going to use the GS911 to activate the ABS pump. After we do that, we're going to repeat the process on the front to get the old fluid out of there. So you got to remember, anytime you work with the brake system, brake fluid is corrosive, so be sure not to spill anything on the paint. If you do, wipe it off right away to prevent any damage. The other thing is, before you open up the master cylinder reservoir here, wipe down any dust just to make sure that nothing gets in there. This is probably the most important part of your bike to keep clean. So on this bike, all you have to do is remove this Phillips screw. This will make the bracket come off. And then now you can unscrew the cap. So be careful here, make sure that you don't drip any fluid onto any of your surfaces here. So you'll have a cap, and then you'll have the rubber boot over here. So this is where the fluid might drip out a little bit. So take your time, be careful, use a rag or a paper towel to catch any fluid that might be dripping down. So the first thing I'll do is just suck out as much of the fluid as I can out of the reservoir, just using a syringe. So be careful here, make sure not to drip any fluid on anything that you care about. So that should about do it. I'm right at the level of the hose. I want to be careful not to introduce any air going into the master cylinder. So next up, I'm going to fill this up with fresh fluid. So you always want to use a fresh container of the fluid. You don't want to let this guy sit around for months on end. It's going to collect moisture, which then compromises fluid. It lowers the boiling point, so you're not going to get as good a performance. So it's always best to use a fresh container. Okay, so very carefully I want to fill this up. Make sure that you don't get anything onto your paint. So the next thing is I'll bleed the master cylinder. Let's remove the dust cap here. This is going to be an 8mm bleed valve. I'm going to use a box wrench, so it's always easier to do it this way. And then I want to position it so that I can easily open it and then close it without removing the tube here. So pop this on. Always helps to have a little piece of a paper towel here, just in case anything leaks. And then the procedure here is going to be squeezing the front brake lever, opening the bleed valve. You'll see some fluid come out of there into the drain reservoir here. And then we're going to close the bleed valve, release the brake lever, and repeat a few times until we see fresh fluid coming out of here. So squeeze, open, close, release, squeeze, open, close, and so on. So as you do this, keep an eye on the fluid level here. Don't let it go below the minimum, and then top it off periodically to right around max. If you space out and some air gets in there, unfortunately you have to start the process again to get that air bubble out. Okay, so refilling the reservoir once for this location in the brake system should be more than enough to get all the brake fluid out of there. So next up, I'm going to remove this guy. When you pull these hoses off, be really careful not to drip any of the brake fluid there. There's going to be some stuck in there, so try to get it out as much as you can, and then use a paper towel or a rag to catch as much as you can. So do that. Hang on to the wrench, and then just give it an opportunity to drain. And it's also a good idea to rinse it off with some soap and water. And then wipe it pretty thoroughly, just to make sure you haven't spilled any brake fluid on any of the painted surfaces here. Alright, so next up I'm going to remove the dust cap from the right caliper bleeding valve. I've got an 8mm or also a 5/16 is the same size. It's easiest to use a box wrench. That way you can easily go back and forth as you open up this valve. So I'll slide this guy over and then put my bleeding hose right over here, and the catch can, I'll just hang it on the bottom of the fork here. That should be good to go. So the way we're going to do this is we'll squeeze the front brake, we'll open the bleed valve, you'll see some fluid come out of there. Now while the brake lever is squeezed, we're going to close the valve and then we're going to release it, which is going to draw new fluid into the master cylinder. Now it's really important to follow the sequence. What you don't want to do is have the bleeding valve open while you release the brake lever, because that's going to draw air through the caliper and then it's going to cause problems. So squeeze it, open it, close it, release. Squeeze it, open it, close it, release. And we'll repeat this over and over again. It's also really important to keep an eye on the master cylinder reservoir. You never want to get the fluid down to the level where it's drawing air inside of it, because you're going to have to start the process over again to get all the air bubbles out of there. So keep an eye on this guy and just repeat. Alright, so I've refilled the master reservoir 5 times. I see clean fluid coming out of here, so that means that I'm good to go. The most important part is that you don't see any air bubbles coming out of here. If you see air bubbles, keep doing it until you don't. That means there's still some air trapped in the system. Now the advantage of starting with the right-hand side first is that everything is right where you need it. So you have easy access to the brake lever, easy access to the caliper, and this is really what's going to take you the longest time. Now when I switch over to the left-hand side, I have a much shorter length of brake line to bleed. It's really going to be about that much, so it should be enough to just fill up the reservoir one time, and that should take care of the left-hand caliper. After that point, we're going to use the GS911 to bleed the ABS module, and then repeat the same steps. So I had a few drops of brake fluid go down my caliper and right around this bleeding valve here. So what I'll do is just use some soap and water to rinse this off, and just make sure that it doesn't damage my wheel or anything else that it might have dripped on. Okay, so I got my brake fluid level right between the minimum and the maximum. I'll go ahead and replace the diaphragm and the cap just temporarily. All right, so now that I've bled the front, right, and left calipers, the next step is going to be to hook up the GS911 cycle through the ABS pump. This is the first generation of the BMW S1000, and I have one of the newer 911s, so I'm going to need to use an adapter. This just converts the newer standard onboard diagnostics port into the older generation round ports. So the diagnostic plug is located under the rear seat. We'll just pop it out. Remove the cap. And then align the arrows to plug it in. All right, so I've got the USB version of the GS911. I've got it plugged into my USB port. First thing that I'll do is turn on the bike, make sure that the run switch is in the on position, and then I'll launch the application here. Okay, so my auto scan detected the bike. We'll go ahead and go to the ABS brakes. We'll select the service functions, ABS functions. The way that this works is you're going to hear the ABS pump actuate, and you're going to pump the front brake. So you'll squeeze it for a second, release, squeeze it for a second, release, squeeze it for a second, release. So you want to do this 3 times. And that's it. So next step, I'm going to turn off the bike and then repeat the bleed procedure to get any of the old fluid back out of the system. So I'll take the cap off one more time. Remove this diaphragm, make sure that nothing drips. And then I'll repeat the same steps again. So I'm going to squeeze the front brake lever, open the bleed valve, close the bleed valve, and repeat. So that should have been more than enough to get the old fluid out of the system. I've topped off the reservoir. Next step is going to be to set the brake fluid level where I want it. So I wanted to get it right below the maximum level here. So what I'll do is squeeze the front brake lever a few more times while opening up the bleed valve and just get it right below the maximum level. And now that I'm sure that the fluid level is correct, I'll go ahead and close this guy up. So gently insert this. You may need to squeeze the rubber a little bit to let the air out so it doesn't puff up. Reinstall the cap. And then reinstall the clip. So it's got this Phillips screw. It's always a good idea to just spray everything down. Make sure that you don't have any extra brake fluid sitting around on any of the surfaces and prevent any damage. All right, so next up, we'll take care of the back brake. It is a separate system, so you have to bleed each individually. We'll use a T25 bit to remove the master cylinder reservoir here. And the easiest thing to do here is to unclip the hose from the clip down here and then gently work out the reservoir to bring it out here to make it easier to refill. Be careful here. I've already broken this guy off a while back when trying to get it out of here, so make sure you don't break the tab off. So take your time. And this will give you very easy access to the reservoir here. Right, so I've got a zip tie over here. I'll just go ahead and attach it to the frame just to make the rest of this job easier. Make sure I don't spill anything. So just like with the front, make sure that you wipe off any dirt or grime from around the reservoir here first. We'll crack it open. And be very careful not to spill anything. So just like with the front, the first thing we want to do is just empty out any leftover brake fluid from the reservoir here, just to make it easier. Use an old syringe. And we'll remove the dust cap. You may need to use a flat blade or a pair of pliers to get that loose if it's on there too tight. And then this will be an 11mm size on the back. I'll just use a box wrench here. Connect up my catch can. And wrap some paper towel around it, just in case. And on the back, we'll use the same process that we did on the front. So we'll press on the brake pedal, open the bleed valve. We'll see the brake fluid come out of there. Keep an eye out for bubbles. You want to make sure that there's no bubbles coming out of there. We'll close the valve, release the brake pedal. We'll do this several times, keeping a close eye on the fluid level here. If it gets low, we'll top it off and then we'll keep doing that. So once we see fresh fluid coming out of here with no air bubbles, we're going to cap this off, connect the GS911 and cycle the ABS pump, and then repeat the whole steps to get the remaining fluid out of the system. So here, we'll go ahead and press on the pedal, open, close, release, press, open, close, release, and repeat. Okay, so I see fresh fluid coming out of here. I have not seen any air bubbles, so all that is looking good. I'm just below the maximum level here, so I'll go ahead and cap this guy off. This is just temporary, and then go back to the GS911 to actuate the brake pump. Okay, so I've got my GS911 open and connected. I'll go ahead and click on the detected vehicle. We'll go to the ABS brakes, service functions, ABS functions, and then in this case, since we're working on the rear brakes, we're going to bleed test the rear system. So the procedure will be the same as the front brake. We're going to click on the button, start the test. Okay, so 3 times. Now we can open up the reservoir again. We're still around max, and then we're going to repeat the bleeding process a few more times to get the old fluid out of the system. So that should have been plenty to get the old fluid out of the system. Next up, I'm going to set the fluid level here, so I'll pump it a couple more times to get it just below the maximum, and then I'll close this guy out. Here, you just want to make sure that the reservoir is roughly in the same position that it will be when it's installed. That way your readings are going to be correct. So here, I'm just a little bit of a max. So Okay, this is about right. So now I'll go ahead and close it up. And I'll spray it down with some soapy water to get any of the fluid out of there. And I'll snip off my zip tie here. And then just gently guide this guy back in. So careful with the tab. Don't do what I did and break it. And double check the fluid level. In this case, we're right between the min and the max. So exactly where I need to be. And just reinstall the screw. I'll spray this down one more time, just for good measure. And then finally, we'll remove the bleeder holes here. So use a piece of paper towel here. There's probably going to be some fluid that's going to drip out, so be ready to catch it. And now I'll just go ahead and clean up the bleed valve here. So I hope you found this helpful. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.